Today I'm going to talk about the famous secret knowledge of the Gnostics, and I'm going to give a deeper explanation of what it is than I've ever heard given previously. So let's start at the beginning. What is Gnosticism? Gnosticism is an umbrella term. We call certain religions Abrahamic religions, and we call certain religions Dharmic religions. We call the Abrahamic religions Abrahamic religions because the religious adherents of those faiths all worship the God of Abraham. We call the Dharmic religions Dharmic religions because the concept of Dharma is central to those religions. And Gnosticism as a term is very similar in that way, but I think it's most comparable to the term paganism. Now, the definition of paganism has changed throughout history. Originally, it just meant any group or any belief system that was not Christian, but in the modern day, I would say that its definition has been expanded to include any belief system or any group that does not belong to one of the major religions, and therefore, when someone says in the modern day that they are a pagan, they could mean a vast array of things. They could mean that they're an Odinist that worships the Norse gods, or they could mean that they belong to some sub-Saharan animist sect. It could mean so many things. Now, Gnosticism is not a term quite as broad as that, but it is still a fairly broad term for different groups that have existed throughout history. And I defined those groups in my book as being, as far as their worldview is concerned, a synthesis of Jewish mysticism, Greek philosophy, and Christian mythology. And I think that's a very good way of summing up the worldview of those groups that fit under the term Gnosticism, those groups that we would call Gnostic. Now, there are many ideas that are commonly associated with the Gnostics. Ideas like that of the demiurge, which, according to some Gnostic groups, was a false god that created the world. And depending on the group, either that god was ignorant of the true god, or he was fully aware of the true god and acting in rebellion of the true god. Then there's the character of Sophia. She can be compared to the Virgin Mary in many ways. The way that Gnostics understand her is very comparable to the way that many Catholics have historically understood the Virgin Mary, but within Gnostic cosmology, Sophia typically had a very specific role, namely that she came from the heavenly realm, the Pleroma, without a consort or without a male counterpart as she ought to have done, and in doing that, she initiated a cosmic catastrophe that ultimately birthed the demiurge and therefore resulted in the material realm. Then there's the idea that this world, because of everything that I just said, is essentially a prison planet for souls. And what we need to do as souls is to escape from this prison planet. Another thing you'll find among those groups that we call Gnostic, which is quite interesting when it comes to those that have what we would call a Christian perspective, is that they did not place a great emphasis on the supposed crucifixion of Christ. Typically, their emphasis was on the resurrection and the significance of that. And I have to say typically because, again, we're talking about a vast array of groups that could believe all kinds of different things. But the reason we can class all of these different groups under the term Gnostic, the reason they are placed under this umbrella term of Gnosticism, is because they have one belief in common. There is one concept that they all share in common, and that is a belief in gnosis. That is the concept of gnosis, which, coming from the Greek, means knowledge. But it means a particular kind of knowledge, and that's what this video is primarily going to be about. Now, as to the origins of Gnosticism, that is somewhat highly debated. Historically, based on the documents that we have, based on the evidence that is available to us, we might say that Gnosticism, this synthesis of Jewish mysticism, Greek philosophy, and Christian mythology, arose at some point in the 2nd century. And so you have these ancient Gnostic groups that existed in the early centuries, but Gnosticism has persisted throughout the centuries in many different forms. The longest lasting Gnostic group are known as the Mandeans, and they exist even up to the present day. But what's interesting about the Mandeans is that they are not a Christian Gnostic group. They actually don't believe that Christ was the Messiah. They instead venerate John the Baptist. And so, although Gnosticism is primarily associated with Christianity, they were not all Christian groups. Most of them were, however, and most people associate the Gnostics as being a form of Christianity. And then you have other groups that existed later on in history than those ancient Gnostic groups, groups like the Cathars that flourished in medieval France. But there are those that claim that the origins of Gnosticism actually precede Christ and therefore Christianity. And although there is really no evidence of that, I can understand that sentiment because, as I said, Gnosticism itself is so clearly influenced by certain ideas that did precede Christ, such as the Jewish mysticism that I talked about and the Greek philosophy that I talked about. So I understand that argument, but in terms of identifiable Gnostic groups, we really have no evidence of them existing until about the 2nd century. Now, another thing that the Gnostics are famous for is being enemies of the Orthodox or Proto-Orthodox Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church and their apologists made many claims about the Gnostics throughout the centuries, claims that we now know to be propaganda, claims that we now know to be false. But I want to be very balanced in my approach here. I don't want to present this video as a case of it's the Catholic Church against the Gnostics. I want to try and present a more balanced perspective. Obviously, if you've watched my content for any length of time, you know that there's much within Gnosticism that I value tremendously. I think it's a tremendously worthwhile philosophy or worldview, if you like, to explore. But the same could be true, I can say the same about Catholicism. I see a lot of value in that as well. So I'll give you a more nuanced perspective of my own view on the Gnostics before we proceed so that you can understand not just my own view of these different groups, but how complicated the Gnostic landscape was. So I think there are 3 texts that really illustrate how vastly different Gnostic groups could be. And so if you know nothing about Gnosticism, what you could do is look up these 3 texts, and you know what? In the description box below, I'll put a link to a great website. It's called Early Christian Writings, and you can find all of those texts there. And this website does not just contain Gnostic texts, it contains texts that would not trouble an Orthodox Christian to any degree, like the Shepherd of Hermas, 1st and 2nd Clement, and so forth. It's a very good resource. But if you look up the following 3 texts and just even have a look at them, you'll see what I mean when I say that Gnostic groups could vary in nature to a very large degree. So the 3 texts in question are the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Truth, and the Apocryphon of John. Now, we don't know who authored the Gospel of Thomas, but I believe it was a Manichaean work. There was a Gnostic group called the Manichaeans, and I believe that they produced the Gospel of Thomas because the content of the Gospel of Thomas is very Manichaean in flavour. We have other Manichaean writings, and the Gospel of Thomas is very similar to them. It even uses some of the same metaphors. Now, the Gospel of Thomas is a list of sayings, and when you're reading or looking at a manuscript in the Coptic Greek, it has no punctuation. It's not formatted in any way. So when it's translated into English, people have to decide for themselves. Translators and interpreters, they have to decide how to parse the text at hand. And this is as true of the text of the New Testament as it is of these non-canonical works. And so the Gospel of Thomas is usually divided into 114 sayings, because that's what the Gospel is. It's a sayings gospel. But versions of the Gospel of Thomas have existed, translations of the Gospel of Thomas have existed, that have divided the work into more or less sayings. But the Gospel of Thomas is very simplistic in what it expresses, to the degree that one is never quite sure whether it should be classed as a Gnostic work, because it doesn't contain those elements that are typically associated with Gnosticism, those elements that I mentioned earlier, namely the Demiurge, Sophia, and this emphasis on the resurrection. It doesn't contain any of that. There's no mention of aeons, archons, and so many of the other things that you might have heard associated with Gnosticism. But I do think it is technically a Gnostic work, purely because it does have this clear orientation towards the concept of gnosis. So you have the Gospel of Thomas, a very simple list of 114 sayings, a very beautiful work, frankly, and one that I am going to focus more on this channel in the future. But then if we turn to the second text at hand, the Gospel of Truth, this is a text that we know the author of. We know that this was written by the Valentinian Gnostics, and possibly by Valentinus himself, the founder of that particular Gnostic group. And then the final text of my choosing was the Apocryphon of John, and this is a Sethian Gnostic text. Now, what you'll see if you look through those three Gnostic texts in order is the way that they get increasingly complicated. The Gospel of Thomas is a simple sayings gospel, 114 sayings. The Gospel of Truth is Valentinus expounding on his views of the resurrection and those matters related to Christ, and it's significantly more complicated than the Gospel of Thomas. But then when you get to the Apocryphon of John, the Sethian text, it is hugely abstract. It attempts to present a cosmology of reality, essentially, and there is just no comparing a work like the Apocryphon of John to the Gospel of Thomas, and yet they are both classed as Gnostic because their authors held to this belief in this central concept of gnosis. And a lot of academics, they don't like the term Gnosticism precisely because in their view it is so hopelessly broad. Precisely because the groups that exist under that term are so different that it's hard to even imagine them existing in the same space at some points. Again, just go and compare the Gospel of Thomas to the Apocryphon of John and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. You would never think that the groups that produced those works have anything, never mind like a lot of other things in common. So I don't want to make this about the Catholic Church versus the Gnostics, and I don't like that kind of, it's either this or that mentality or approach. What I'd like to believe, I know it's not the case, but what I'd like to believe is that we can all agree that what we want is the truth. And so whether we're looking at Catholicism or whether we're looking at Gnosticism, we can hopefully approach things the way I always try to approach things, which is that when we're looking at the claims of any given group or any given text, we should attempt to verify those claims, whether that's intellectually or spiritually, and we accept what's true and useful, and we reject what's false and not useful. Tribalism is not useful in this instance. Now, I don't reject tribalism as a whole. That would be ridiculous. The moment you prioritize your family or your spouse over anyone else, you're technically being tribalistic, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But when it comes to truth, I think it's a terrible idea to draw battle lines and become tribalistic about this, to pick a belief system or a religion and just argue for it no matter what, even when you know you're in the wrong. That's clearly foolish. We should all want the truth if we are seeking to know God and to honor God. And so I said that the church was guilty of pushing a lot of propaganda against the Gnostics because they held them to be antichrist in many ways. Now, again, we know a lot of that propaganda to be false. There was a certain bishop, for example, that claimed that the Gnostics ate babies. Just ridiculous, silly propaganda like that you always get within any conflict throughout human history, whether it's an actual war or whether it's a physical war or whether it's a war of ideas. You always get this kind of propaganda. And so while a lot of what the proto-Orthodox and Orthodox Catholic Church claimed about the Gnostics was simply false, and while I think we would all agree they were certainly morally wrong for the way that they persecuted the Gnostics and destroyed their works, the medieval Cathars that I mentioned earlier were exterminated by the Catholic Church. But I must bring balance to this issue by saying that some Gnostic groups, and again, when we say Gnostic groups, we're talking about a wide array of different belief systems. Some Gnostic groups were undeniably strange in their practices and in their ideas, strange to a degree that you can understand why someone from a proto-Orthodox or an Orthodox perspective would be repulsed by them. And maybe I'll get into some of those ideas at some point in the future, but we know some Gnostic groups held these ideas because we actually have texts that contain these ideas, and I don't really want to get into them now because it would take me off on a massive, massive tangent. But the Gnostics certainly had some strange ideas that would certainly be off-putting to any believer that was coming from anything close to an Orthodox, Christian perspective, or what has come to be called an Orthodox Christian perspective. But an interesting phenomenon that you see within a certain subset of human beings, both in the present day and down throughout history, is that they often accuse others of what they themselves are guilty of. So, a very common charge historically against the Gnostics as a whole is that they were guilty of prizing intellectual knowledge above all else, the secret knowledge that they are so often associated with. The Orthodox Church and its apologists accuse the Gnostics of prioritizing intellectual truth above all else, having these secrets and so forth. And you will often hear that accusation against the Gnostics repeated today by those who belong to some branch of mainstream Christianity. And most of those people, by the way, do not understand Gnosticism one bit. Like, the moment you hear someone lay the blame for the modern gender confusion at the feet of Gnosticism, you can be assured that that person doesn't have the first clue about Gnosticism historically. A lot of the people that repeat these ancient charges against the Gnostics in the modern day don't have the first clue about Gnosticism, and it's evident the moment they make any statement about it. But the irony is that the Orthodox Church accusing the Gnostics of prioritizing intellectual knowledge and the pursuit of same is ironic because they do that very thing and they always have done. Western Christianity has always prioritized theology above all else. And theology is itself intellectual knowledge or intellectual understanding. It just happens to be intellectual knowledge and understanding that relates to God, but that doesn't change the fact that it's fundamentally intellectual understanding. And Judgment Day, as I've said, is so often presented by the Orthodox Church, both historically and now, as a theology test. When a mainstream Christian talks about essential doctrine and non-essential doctrine, what they mean is that there are doctrines, i.e. ideas, that you must believe because it's important for your salvation, and then there are those other ideas that you can, you can be wrong about and be okay in the eyes of God. So it's not just that the Western Church, especially historically, has prioritized intellectual knowledge themselves. It's that they actually make this intellectual knowledge, and specifically having the right intellectual knowledge, having the right theology, a matter of salvation. Mainstream Christians can give lip service in any way they want to salvation being about anything else, but when it comes down to it, anyone who has had any experience in the mainstream church knows that what they care about is you having the right beliefs. It's the very thing that separates one of their denominations from the other. If someone in a denomination that accepts infant baptism decides to reject infant baptism, if they believe strongly enough that they're right, they will leave that church and find another church that affirms their belief because it's all about the theology. So the charge against the Gnostics that they prioritized intellectual knowledge and that they believed it somehow saved them is very ironic coming from people who have always done and prioritized that very same thing. And I must say that even certain scholars, certain academics that I very much respect, have this same false idea concerning Gnosis and what exactly the secret knowledge of the Gnostics was. Bart Ehrman is a great example of this. Now, I have a lot of respect for Bart Ehrman. He's done some tremendous work. But he too presents the Gnostics almost as if they were these groups that were constantly teasing people with some kind of secret intellectual knowledge, in the same way that you know how sometimes you'll get these organizations, these dubious organizations popping up, and they'll tell their members that, if you just invest $10,000 more, you can ascend to the next level and be initiated into this knowledge, and by the time you've spent $2 million, you will finally reach the highest degree, and you will learn the secrets that no one outside of that degree learns. Bart Ehrman often presents the Gnostics as if they were doing that kind of thing, where they had all these strange rituals and were just leading people into some intellectual understanding that no one else knew. And I think the reason for that, I think the reason that Bart Ehrman and others like him, and indeed so many mainstream Christians, have this misunderstanding of the Gnostics and what Gnosis was exactly, what the secret knowledge of the Gnostics was exactly, is because they're approaching it from an intellectual perspective, and they're trying to understand it from an intellectual framework. Whereas for the entire time, of course, being who I am and given my background, I've always approached the Gnostics from a mystic perspective. And so when I read the Gnostic works and I see certain things said, I see certain things expressed, I understand that from a mystic perspective. It resonates with me from a mystic perspective. I understand what the Gnostics were trying to convey there, whereas if you're approaching such statements from an intellectual perspective, you wouldn't really have any idea what the Gnostics were talking about. You'd have to sit there trying to figure it out. And without that inclination towards mystic practice yourself, you're invariably going to come away with some intellectual conclusion that is misguided in some way. So, the gnosis of the Gnostics, the secret knowledge of the Gnostics, and this is what most people don't understand, it wasn't any form of intellectual knowledge. Now, there were certain Gnostic groups that had knowledge that they thought, intellectual knowledge that they thought was important. For example, after death, if you have to ascend through the heavens, how do you pass this archon and that archon? What's the secret word to pass this archon and that archon? There were the more obscure, advanced, complicated Gnostic groups that had ideas like that. And I personally don't have any interest in those kind of Gnostic groups. I like the simple Gnostic groups like the Manichaeans that produce works like the Gospel of Thomas, because I think that in any area of spirituality, when you begin complicating things, when you start having to develop this enormously elaborate theology and it's just so abstract, it becomes actually mind-bending. You're obviously going further away from actual grounded reality, and therefore, in my view, from genuine spirituality itself, which is all about being grounded in reality and accepting things as they are in the moment and so forth. So the knowledge of the Gnostics, fundamentally, the ultimate knowledge, the secret knowledge, the gnosis of the Gnostics, was not a form of intellectual knowledge. It was, as I've said previously, what we would call divine insight or revelation. Now, in the past, whenever I've pointed this out, I've just left it there. Even in my book, I pretty much just left it there because my book wasn't about Gnosticism specifically, it was about mysticism as a whole. And because Gnosis is not a form of intellectual knowledge, but rather a form of divine insight or revelation, you should understand that if you're using the term Gnostic, not in a sectarian way, if when you use the term Gnostic, you're referring to a worldview broadly and not to any specific group like the Valentinians or the Sethians, then the term Gnostic in a way does become a synonym for mystic, and therefore Gnosticism as a term becomes almost a synonym for mysticism. Because Gnosticism really, at its core, is just a certain flavour of mysticism. And that's why I thought it was fitting to evoke it so much in my book. But when I've mentioned that Gnosis is divine insight or revelation previously, even in my book, I just left it there. But in this video, to make good on my promise, the promise of the title, the promise of the thumbnail, whatever they end up being, I don't know at the time of recording. But to make good on whatever promises I make, I'm going to go into it further to explain, because it can be a bit frustrating if someone just says, okay, Gnosis is very comparable to what we would call divine insight and revelation, just leaving it there, because it doesn't tell you too much, because concepts like divine insight and revelation to most souls are themselves hopelessly abstract, and they don't really know how to even imagine those things. They can't really get an intellectual grasp of them. But I've had many transcendent experiences in my time, and I've thought a lot about how best to explain these things to those who maybe have not, or once did and have simply forgotten it, or are just not too inclined to think these things through and think through how to best articulate them. But it's amazing to me. We live in a very complicated world, and there are lots of things in the external world to try and get a grasp of. But you know, our internal world is so much more complicated and so much more rich. And I think if we would all just spend more time reflecting upon our internal world and what's going on in there, and thinking about things in the way that I'm about to elaborate upon them, we'd all be richer for that, spiritually speaking. Okay, so this, what I'm about to explain, is part of the reason that I felt it very necessary to, before writing my book, I felt it very necessary to sit there and think about a good way to divide reality up. So, and a good way to divide it up, a good illustration is to say, okay, there are fundamentally four realms of reality. You've got the material realm, which we're all familiar with. And each four realms of reality, we have a corresponding layer of our being. So when it comes to the material realm, obviously we have our physical bodies that allows us to traverse that realm. Then, of course, there is the mental realm, the mind. And we also have a mental body. We might also call that our psychology. Up to this point, no one's going to disagree with either of those things. Even the most staunch materialist will be along on the ride with me up to this point. But then we have what I call the ethereal realm. Others might call it the astral realm. And at this point, the materialist will perk up. They'll think, oh, what's going on here? He's trying to slip in some metaphysical shenanigans here. Which technically I am, but I think it's perfectly acceptable even to the materialist. Because there is the ethereal realm, which would be the realm of the dead, of ghosts, of spirits, and so forth. But we very clearly have that. We very clearly have an ethereal form ourselves. An ethereal form outside of our physical bodies enables us to traverse the ethereal realm. In the same way that one might see a ghost walking a hallway, that would be an ethereal form. But to make this more comfortable to some of you listening, think of it this way. If you're thinking about all the phenomenon that we as souls can experience, of course, we have the five senses. They belong to the physical, obviously. And then we have all kinds of psychological phenomena, which clearly belong to the mind. But then we have more subtle phenomenon like the emotions, the conscience, and the intuition. On what level of our being we experience those things, or comparable phenomenon, has long been the subject of debate. And this is why a recognition of our ethereal body is so necessary. You can leave the supernatural aspect at the door if you want, but it's very necessary to acknowledge that there is a level of our being, whatever you take it to be, upon which we experience emotions and more subtle phenomenon like the conscience and the intuition. I call this level the ethereal level. Now, the fourth level of our reality, as I parse reality out, is what I call the spirit. Now, this is where it becomes confusing for a lot of people, because for a lot of people, what I call the ethereal realm, what others would call the astral realm, is the spiritual realm. When people think they've seen a ghost, for example, they'll call that spiritual. I don't do that because of my mystic perspective on things, because of a recognition of what the Buddhists would call emptiness. The fact that the highest manifestation of reality, that which one cannot help but call spirit, is non-phenomenal, and therefore is by definition not any kind of supernatural phenomenon, because supernatural phenomenon is by definition phenomenal. If you see a ghost, for example, or anything like that, if you experience any kind of paranormal activity, the very fact that you're able to perceive it means it is phenomenal and therefore not of the spiritual realm. Now, I perhaps made a mistake going in to as much depth on that subject as I have in this particular monologue, but I felt it was necessary. There's the summary of the four levels of reality as I see it, and as I always am eager to caution, we must not mistake models for the thing itself. The model of reality I just gave you is precisely that, and it's just intended to be helpful. It's not meant to become a dogma that you can't stray from. If someone were to come up with a more fulfilling or useful model of reality, then that would be great. The Theosophists divide reality up, a certain sect of Theosophists at least, they divide reality up into 7 different layers of reality. I don't think that's necessary. I think the 4 I've just elaborated upon is plenty enough to adequately explain and place all of the phenomenon that we can experience, and to enable us to have a more fulfilling theology. So we have matter, mind, ether, and the non-phenomenal spirit. And the more you go down that list, the more subtle reality becomes. So matter, for example, is very, very crude, extremely crude. If you hit your head off the nearest wall, you'll feel just how crude it is. Mind is considerably more subtle than matter. Ether is even more subtle than mind, in the same way that your emotions or your conscience or intuition, they're far more subtle than those thoughts that you have in your head. And the spirit, being non-phenomenal, is best compared to silence. The mystery of silence is a huge subject within mystic thought that, again, I'll have to elaborate upon at some point in the future. The important point is, to come back to the topic at hand, is that this thing that we call gnosis, this thing being divine insight or revelation, this secret knowledge that the Gnostics had, and the Gnostics said was essential to salvation, it is necessarily experienced on the ethereal realm, or the ethereal layer of our being. It is necessarily experienced in our ethereal body. And being an explorer of the inner world, as it were, I can go some way to explaining what it feels like. So, there are certain experiences that I'm going to just assume, and I think safely assume, most of you have had in your experience here in the world. Specifically, the experience of falling in love, being heartbroken, and being depressed. Now, I chose those 3 specifically because what those 3 experiences have in common, aside from the fact that they're all ethereal phenomenon that we experience on the ethereal level of our being, what they all have in common is that they're powerful enough to permeate your entire being. You feel them extremely, extremely deeply. So when you're in love, it colors your entire world. And just as with emotions generally, and the conscience and the intuition, you're not experiencing them in your mind. You know that. Once you start experiencing something, it will be processed by the mind, but the experience itself does not stem from the mind. It stems from what has been poetically called the heart. When someone says to you, for example, "What does your heart tell you?" they either mean, "What are you feeling about this emotionally?" or they mean, "What does your intuition tell you?" And the reason for that is because such things as emotions, the conscience, and the intuition, they are not experienced within the mind, they are experienced in, we're talking in spatial terms, somewhere around the heart. When you're in love or when you're heartbroken, you can feel your heart aching, even though it's clearly not a physical thing. It's an emotional thing. But that's why people poetically use the term heart to refer to emotions, conscience, and intuition. But when you're in love, when you're heartbroken, or when you're deeply depressed, those states of being can absolutely uh, permeate you entirely. And the reason those experiences in particular are good examples is because of how much they can permeate your experience of life. When you fall in love, that love, that feeling you have, that ethereal phenomenon that you're experiencing can be so all-consuming that it completely changes your perspective of reality. You fall in love, and you might be walking down the street, skipping the next day. You're that happy. Your perspective on the world has changed. Everything is right with the world now that you're in love, right? And the same is true when you're heartbroken in the opposite direction. You lose someone that you love in some fashion or other, and the world that yesterday was so bright and cheerful has now become this dark place devoid of purpose and devoid of meaning for you. And depression has a very similar effect. So the important point here is that it's not just that we experience these things on what I would call the ethereal level of our being. It's that there are certain experiences that are so powerful that they can not only permeate our experience, but completely change our perspective on reality. Well, the feeling of gnosis, that which we call divine insight and revelation, is very comparable to that. It's just that it's amplified by, by a significant degree, to put it mildly. The experience of gnosis, as the Gnostics understood it, was comparable to that scene in The Matrix where Neo suddenly begins to see the world in code. After, of course, he's very symbolically come back from the veil, as it were. And this is why, incidentally, there are whole channels dedicated to decoding the Matrix, but this is why, incidentally, um, Morpheus at one point in the film says that no one can tell you what the Matrix is. And it seems like a strange line of dialogue because actually they can. What is the Matrix? It's a computer simulation. In fact, Morpheus himself explains what the Matrix is quite easily earlier on, but that's kind of the point, is that it's one thing to intellectually understand a concept like the Matrix, or in this case, Gnosis, but to experience it is something else, and it's the experience that can't be articulated, which makes explaining the secret knowledge of the Gnostics and what it is near impossible, because it can't be processed by the mind, much less articulated by the tongue. But I'm doing my best to give you comparisons here. So, the secret knowledge of the Gnostics was this gnosis, which was not intellectual knowledge, it was an experience of the divine. It was a revelation that, in the same way how being in love or being heartbroken can completely change your perspective on the world around you, the experience of gnosis, it cracked open your being, as it were, and enabled you to understand spiritual realities, enabled you to understand things in a way you've never understood them before, and thereby be saved, which makes a lot more sense, right? Because to say that the Gnostics had some kind of intellectual knowledge, like some kind of proposition that saved you intellectually, that saved your soul in the same way that the Orthodox Christians always claim that, if you accept certain doctrines, then you'll be saved on Judgment Day, like as a theology test. That sounds a bit odd, but the reality is that the saving knowledge of the Gnostics was not intellectual knowledge. It was this experience where the veil is lifted from your eyes, essentially, and you're able to see things in a way that you never saw them before. And obviously, in this context, we're talking about, for example, seeing God in the world around you, finally understanding your place in things, and what your mission is as a soul. And so, for the Gnostics, This explains why the Gnostics had the certain perspectives that they did on different things. For many Gnostic groups, for example, when Jesus in the Gospels, he goes down into the river Jordan and he emerges from being submerged and the dove descends upon him, that's a clear example of an individual undergoing gnosis, which is why the Gospels only care to record, for the most part, what happened after that point, the ministry of Jesus, as opposed to what he was doing when he was 23 years old and hanging about the streets of Galilee or whatever. Um, this is also why the Gnostics loved the Apostle Paul, because historically within Christianity, there in the ancient world there was this division. When it came to the Apostle Paul, you had groups like the Ebionites, who were very for Torah keeping, who really didn't like the Apostle Paul. But then you had those other groups who were more orientated towards Spirit believing, being guided by the Spirit, who really loved the Apostle Paul because he had that exact same emphasis, that exact same focus. And that's precisely why the Gnostics loved the Apostle Paul so much as well, is because he emphasized what they would understand as gnosis. And you can see it in the writings of the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul outright talks about, the secret knowledge that is not available to the kings of this age and things like that. The Gnostics obviously reading that, they completely resonated with that. In fact, historically, it's more likely than anything that Gnosticism was ultimately formed from the words of the Apostle Paul, again, in conjunction with a lot of Jewish mysticism, and especially later on, a lot of Greek philosophy, specifically philosophy coming from Pythagoras and through Plato. So that is what the secret knowledge of the Gnostics is. It's not a intellectual knowledge that can exist in the form of a proposition that you either accept or reject. It's an experiential knowledge. And once you've experienced this gnosis, once the scales have been lifted from your eyes, your mind can't understand what just happened, because being of the ethereal realm, it transcends the mind, and because the mind can't process it and comprehend it in any coherent way, you can't articulate it, but it happened, and your perspective on reality is completely changed, and you are therefore a Gnostic from that point forth. You have been initiated. You are now one who knows, which is what Gnostic means. Very, very mystic in flavour. And that's why I said earlier that I think the reason that so many fail to understand what the Gnostics were fundamentally all about in the secret knowledge of the Gnostics is because they're approaching it from a secular intellectual perspective. Whereas for someone that's looking at Gnostic works from a mystic perspective, from the perspective of someone who's always sought that kind of understanding in the first place, what they're saying is too obvious, really. So a question that many would have then is, how does one obtain this gnosis? Well, different Gnostic groups, and certainly the more time went on through the centuries, as I pointed out earlier with my three example texts, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Truth, and the Apocryphon of John, as you go down through the centuries, Gnostic systems become increasingly more elaborate, increasingly more complicated, to the point where, in my opinion, they become almost useless to the modern reader, because you've got so much to unpack, so much to decode, that it's not frankly worth the time. And so there were certain Gnostic groups that had very specific rituals and ceremonies and all kinds of elaborate things you had to do in order to be initiated into this or into that. But at its core, it's really very simple. Since we experience gnosis on within our ethereal body, but since it comes from a higher realm, namely that of the spirit, you must engage in those practices in which you are at least engaging with the ethereal realms, if not the spirit itself. Practices such as prayer and meditation. So, an act of grace is always possible. The grace of God is always possible. And when the Gnostics heard the account of the Apostle Paul's conversion, when Christ appeared to the Apostle Paul and said, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? They undoubtedly would have seen that as an act of grace, as every Christian would. And so there's always the grace of God. You never know the way in which God is going to move for his own purposes. It's possible that someone could undergo an experience of gnosis completely out of the blue for no apparent reason whatsoever, and that would be the grace of God. It would be by definition a miracle. But if one is to seek to consciously obtain it, as the Gnostics did, then one must necessarily engage in practices such as prayer and meditation, because it's only practices like that that have us engage with the ethereal realm and ideally with the spirit that is God. And we may even ask God specifically for this gnosis, or an experience of gnosis, an experience of divine insight or revelation. But this is the reason that the concept of gnosis and the secret knowledge of the Gnostics has eluded so many otherwise brilliant intellects, is because it's not of the intellectual realm. It's of a realm beyond that. And so if you're approaching the Gnostic texts just trying to understand things in intellectual terms and not in mystical terms, then you're going to have a very hard time understanding a lot of their writings. And if I do what I said I might do earlier, which is focus on the Gospel of Thomas a lot in the coming future, you're going to see that very quickly, despite the fact that, as I said, the Gospel of Thomas is a relatively simple Gnostic work. It's just a simple list of 114 sayings, but even within those sayings, those really short sayings, there's a lot of profound wisdom there. And if I do cover it, you'll see that. And so that is the secret knowledge of the Gnostics. It's what they called gnosis. Coming from the Greek means knowledge, but it's a very specific kind of knowledge. Non-intellectual knowledge, but a knowledge that must be experienced. And the reason the Gnostics believed that that knowledge was saving knowledge is not at all comparable to the mainstream churches of today, where what they mean by saving knowledge is intellectually accepting the correct doctrines as they see them, so that God will give you full marks on your theology test on Judgment Day. No, the reason the Gnostic knowledge saved is because it fundamentally transformed your state of being and the way you were able to perceive reality. Again, it caused the scales to fall away from your eyes and see things anew. That's what the Gnostics sought, and it's what every mystic, which is to say every individual who has sought union with the divine down throughout history, has sought. And this is why, because I always had an interest in mysticism, or at least since my spiritual experience I did, that's why the Gnostics were immediately attractive to me. You know, people are attracted to the Gnostics for all kinds of reasons. A lot of the time, people are attracted to the Gnostics just because they have this kind of juvenile aversion to mainstream Christianity, because having been raised in the West, it's become common to them, it's become dull. It's the fusty old church down the road. I'm not interested in that. I want something more exciting. And so they come upon the ideas of the Gnostics, and especially certain Gnostic groups which encourage all kinds of behaviours that the ancient Gnostics never would. And so that appeals to them for that reason. There's all kinds of reasons that someone might feel drawn to the Gnostics and their texts and their ideas, but for me, it's the fact that having an interest in mysticism, when I first encountered Gnostic ideas, and when I first began reading their texts, not only did they resonate with me on a very deep level, which is very important, but I understood immediately what they were saying because of the mystic understanding I'd acquired from different sources previously. The Gnostic perspective on the world just made sense to me. And I also understood why they had been themselves so misunderstood down throughout the centuries. Because, as is the case with all mystic perspectives, they're very easy to understand when people are futilely trying to approach them with an intellectual lens, as it were, trying to put these things in a nutshell, put ideas into a nutshell that really can't be put into a nutshell, and trying to frame in intellectual terms that which by definition transcends the intellect.